I'm glad you have come back to the search for the spookiest. I bid you welcome. There are so many vampire movies. Where do you even start? Well, there's only one place you really can start, and that's with Count Dracula. As I always say in the search for the spookiest videos, I am not considering Dracula or any of the Universal classics as runner-ups for the best, because I think Dracula from 1931 is the best vampire movie of all time. So I'm not looking for that. Like, I feel like as a Universal mega fan like I am, I'm pretty biased towards the Universal monsters. So like I've said before, like Creature from the Black Lagoon was excluded from Gilman and everything. You know, The Mummy was excluded from Mummies because it's just not an exciting video. I'm just going to say that that's the best and end it at that. But we can't just gloss over Dracula from 1931. It's one of the most influential horror movies of all time, even just outside of the vampire genre. Its spooky, dreary atmosphere, its quiet soundtrack with no music but eerie sounds, and an outstanding, unparalleled performance by Bela Lugosi, as well as lots of other amazing performances. 1931's Dracula is just untouchable in my opinion. It really is the cream of the crop vampire movie. It is what you want to watch when you want to see a spooky vampire movie for Halloween. I already went into full detail on this movie and how much I love it and why I love it in my top 10 Universal Monsters video, so I'm not going to touch upon that here. Let's just say it's an absolute classic and move on. One thing I didn't mention in my Universal Monsters video, though, is the Spanish version. The Spanish version of Dracula, you may think is just a dub, but it's not. It's actually completely reshot with totally different actors for Spanish audiences. But I actually, admittedly, sorry, have never seen it. It's nothing against subtitles or anything. I'm totally fine reading subtitles, but I just never really came across it. I never had an opportunity to see it, and I guess I'm not as driven to see it as I am some of the other Universal Monster movies. I know a lot of people say there's a lot better camera work and everything in the movie, that there's still amazing performances from those actors, but I feel like Bela Lugosi is Dracula. When you want to watch Dracula, you want to see Bela Lugosi. And I mean, Dwight Frye and Edward Van Sloan and all of them are fantastic in their roles too. So it's hard for me to want to watch the exact same movie, but without the actors that I know and love. At some point I'll get around to it, but don't worry, I will check it out at some point. I know that's like a big one. Before Universal did Dracula, there was of course Nosferatu. There were supposedly other Dracula or vampire movies prior to Nosferatu, but that is the oldest surviving vampire movie. Everyone knows the story that, you know, it's meant to be Dracula, but the wife of Bram Stoker would not give up the rights at the time when the movie was made because it was not public domain yet. And so they had to change the names to Orlok and all that. But he's Count Dracula, and, you know, there's Nina Harker and Jonathan Harker and all that. And every version I've ever seen, I've actually never seen a version with Orlok and all those other names. But it's a chilling, beautiful movie. It is a perfect example of how eerie silent film could be and how much you can do with so little. I think silent horror is some of the spookiest horror there is. You can see it as overacting and kind of hammy, but you kind of had to be when there's no dialogue. You need to get the emotion across. But just what they were able to do in silent films, they had so little resources, so little ways of conveying things to the audience, that I think definitely silent film deserves more credit than it even gets by most audiences, because you can watch Nosferatu, and yes, there are like little dialogue screens and everything like most silent films, but like it's actually a pretty good atmospheric, chilling movie. I think it's really like a perfect setting the mood kind of movie. Like all the imagery from that film is just so haunting and creepy and spooky and awesome. And it's just perfect to put up, you know, at Halloween time and put it on a TV running in the background or something. Nosferatu is an amazing movie, but I don't know if I'm really going to consider any Dracula movie to be the best film, because the way I look at it is if I'm not counting Universal Dracula, every other Dracula movie is more or less just an inferior version of the same story in my mind, because I think Universal Dracula is the best. So as much as I love Nosferatu and other adaptations of Dracula, I just see them as below Bela Lugosi's performance, so it'd be kind of unfair for me to just pick another Dracula movie. But there were quite a lot. There was Son of Dracula with Lon Chaney Jr., which, very confusingly, they advertise it as, you know, he was the son of Dracula, but he's actually not. Even though he goes by the name Count Alucard, and the Castlevania games would later adapt that and make that the name of the actual son of Dracula, he's actually just Dracula in the movie. He's just going under the name Alucard because he's terrible at picking an alias that people won't recognize. Like, oh, let me just swap the name around. But there was also Dracula's daughter. Also, again, I talked about this in my Universal Monsters video, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I think it's an underrated classic. I think it's actually a really, really good movie. And, you know, it's not on the level of Dracula, not even close, but it's damn good. And I think it is a shame that she doesn't really get recognized as one of the Universal monsters as often. You know, Countess Zaleska is a great character, and she's really just left out of the whole Universal Monsters pantheon. But if we're talking Dracula, we gotta fast forward to the 50s. We gotta talk about Hammer. The Hammer Studios produced more Dracula movies than probably any other studio ever, and Christopher Lee is an outstanding Count Dracula. Hammer definitely took a little longer to grow on me than Universal did. Universal was like, as soon as I got into the Universal movies, I was a sucker for Universal. I loved the Universal monster movies. I got into Hammer after Universal, and at first I didn't really quite see what all the buzz was. I also started with the Satanic Rites of Dracula, which is the last and worst of the Dracula movies, while not counting that Kung Fu one they did. But when I actually went back and watched Horror of Dracula, or Dracula for English audiences, and, you know, Curse of Frankenstein and all that stuff, then I started to realize how amazing the studio actually was. It's a very, very loose adaptation. Universal's was already very loose when it comes to the Bram Stoker novel, but I think the Hammer one's even looser, actually. It's very different from the actual, you know, literary source, but it's still damn good. I think it's a great movie. It has amazing sets, amazing atmosphere. It's definitely worth checking out, and I'd say a decent chunk of the Dracula movies are worth seeing by Hammer. I'd say maybe watch the first 3 or 4, and I am counting Brides of Dracula. I know that one doesn't have Dracula in it, and not a lot of people like it, but I think it's actually still a pretty damn good vampire movie, if not actually one of the Christopher Lee Count Dracula films. It still has a lot of mood and atmosphere and suspense and everything, so I don't think it's a bad movie, honestly. It has that Hammer feel. I love that Hammer feel with all those aristocratic mansions and castles and everything. Like, they really did a good job of making horror that looks like old-timey horror, but modernized in color. So it's like you still get that old European feel when you look at it, but it doesn't quite have that black and white, cobweb covered, blanketed in fog look that the Universal movies always had, though there is still quite a lot of fog in Hammer movies. And speaking of Hammer, they also have a big trilogy of vampire movies unrelated to Dracula, which is The Vampire Lovers, Lust for a Vampire, and Twins of Evil. They vary in quality. I would say that The Vampire Lovers is the best one by far of the 3. That may just be bias because it stars Ingrid Pitt and the lovely Madeline Smith as, well, vampire lovers. They're 2 lesbian lovers in the movie. Well, Madeline Smith, I guess not at first, or at least she doesn't know that about herself, but Ingrid Pitt comes in as a vampire. It's based on Carmilla, who's actually a literary vampire who predates Dracula, and she was always a bisexual vampire in all the literature. I also think Dracula's Daughter by Universal is slightly inspired by Carmilla also, because she's questionably bisexual. There is the scene where she brings the girl back to her apartment to paint her, and it's pretty romantic. It's played off like pretty romantic for the time, but it's never really stated. But boy, is it stated in The Vampire Lovers. These vampires are having hot gay sex all the time. The movie portrays them as being evil, and yes, they are evil. At least Ingrid Pitt is evil. I don't really know about Madeline Smith, and she's really just a victim in most of it. But her family's kind of horrible too. So, even though she is a bad guy, you kind of find yourself siding with Ingrid Pitt and wanting her and Madeline Smith to just fly off and be immortal and sexy forever with each other and happy and just being vampires for all time. Like, you kind of want to see that happen because the family's so unlikable. But it's weird because, you know, Ingrid Pitt is a horrible monster too. So it's like, for some reason I just find myself siding with Ingrid Pitt and Madeline Smith in the movie. I feel like Madeline Smith kind of enjoys being with Ingrid Pitt as a vampire. I feel like her life was kind of crummy before that, so it almost seems like they're not really rescuing her. They think they are, but they're not. Even the mom, it's actually kind of funny. The mom is like begging Ingrid Pitt at some point to, near the end of the movie when she's about to leave, to like take her with her, turn her into a vampire. It's like, Ingrid Pitt is just, I guess, so hot that like every woman just suddenly realizes she's gay when they're looking at Ingrid Pitt and they want to live with her forever. But I mean, Ingrid Pitt flew through your window and turned you into a vampire and said, okay, you're gonna live with me forever. I think most people would be pretty okay with that. But I think Vampire Lovers, aside from that, is still a great movie. It's actually pretty damn good. I think it's one of Hammer's best that isn't like, you know, first Frankenstein, first Dracula, first Mummy movie and all that. I think as like one of their one-off ones, it's probably their best one. And that might be due to the fact that there is a literary source it's inspired by. Now, before we get off of Dracula, I just want to acknowledge, I know there's tons and tons of Dracula movies over the years. Like, you know, there's the other Universal one that came out in the 70s. There's the Francis Ford Coppola one called Bram Stoker's Dracula. And I guess I'll just touch on that one real quick, because that was like a big deal when it came out. That was like the first Dracula movie to really be like, okay, this one's just as big as Universal or Hammer. Like from the 30s all the way to the 90s, the depiction of Dracula was either Bela Lugosi or after the 50s, also Christopher Lee. Those two are who you were talking about if you said Dracula. But Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula is... it's good. He meant to be more faithful to the novel, and it is a lot more faithful to the novel than most other film versions of Dracula, but it still strays pretty far in some ways, like making Mina actually fall in love with Count Dracula and make Dracula kind of like a tragic anti-hero. Like, Dracula is a pretty terrible person. Like, it's kind of hard to make you feel sorry for Dracula. Did you see what he did to Lucy? Like, come on, he's pretty evil. He's not that sympathetic. I do think this movie has a lot of style. It's like you're watching a, you know, over 2-hour music video. It has a lot of style, but I don't think it's really like the greatest Dracula movie ever made. It's a good effort, but it's not as fantastic as I think most people made it out to be when it was new. It definitely inspired a lot of Dracula stuff after it. I feel like every time someone does the Dracula story now, he's sympathetic. Like the Castlevania game, Symphony of the Night completely borrows this story. And it's all about, you know, his human lover who was taken from him, and he actually had a real relationship with her, and it's tragic that he became so evil because he actually loved a human being. And it's kind of funny they call her Lisa in the Castlevania games, because in all Dracula movies over the decades, they've screwed up sometimes. Some of the movies, they swap Mina Harker's name with Lucy, her friend. So sometimes the role of Mina is called Lucy and the role of Lucy is called Mina. But then other movies get it right. So in Symphony of the Night, they said it straight. They named her Lisa. Lucy and Mina combined. That's a pretty good way to settle that for good. But I'm getting a little sick of the sympathetic vampire all the time. I would like to get a nice evil vampire again at some point. Also, many movies that are not supposed to be about the famous Count are still kind of about Dracula. There's Return of the Vampire from 1943, and it has Bela Lugosi dressed up as Count Dracula from the Universal Monster movies. But he's not Count Dracula. It's an unofficial movie. It's not made by Universal. But it's really like Bela Lugosi playing Dracula for the last time. Well, the last time in a non-comedy. It's actually a pretty darn good movie just for spooky atmosphere. I'm not going to say it's like genius writing or amazing acting across the board or anything, but it's not bad. But I mean, goddamn, the mood is so good. There is so much fog just spilling over everything in this movie. Awesome shots of graveyards with gnarled trees and tilted headstones and everything. Seeing not Dracula, rise over it and, like, you know, lift his cape up like a bat is just so cool. He has a werewolf working for him who just talks like a normal guy, but it's cool to see, like, okay, here's Dracula commanding a werewolf, like commanding another one of the Universal monsters, basically. It's a pretty good monster mash, even if it's unofficial. I think it's definitely worth checking out. If you love the Universal monster movies, I think of Return of the Vampire as like a lost Universal monster movie. It fits right in. But there have been countless remakes and spin-offs of Dracula, you know, comedies like Dracula Dead and Loving It and everything. So there's more than enough Dracula you could talk about. Let's move away from Dracula finally and just talk about some general vampire films. Speaking of comedies, there are a lot of vampire comedies. There's What We Do in the Shadows, Dark Shadows, Blood and Donuts. But one that stands out to me as just a straight comedy, not a horror comedy, is Sundown, A Vampire in Retreat. It's about like a resort out in like the American West, a town just for vampires to live, so it's like they can live there in peace. But it has some good style to it. It is funny. I do think the whole setting is interesting and fun. And it's pretty cool we get to see David Carradine, the son of John Carradine, playing Count Dracula himself. Sorry, spoilers, but the big vampire turns out to be Count Dracula in the end. But it's pretty cool because John Carradine played Dracula in House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula by Universal back in the 40s. So it's pretty cool to see them, you know, reference that with his son David Carradine playing Dracula himself. And you always gotta love Bruce Campbell. Here he's playing a descendant of Van Helsing, and he is funny as hell in this movie. It's not like the most memorable vampire movie of all time, but it's definitely a lot of fun, and I think you'll be surprised if you watch it. A lot of people don't seem to rate it very high. It gets very low reviews most of the time, but I think it's fun. I think it's funny. If you put yourself in the right mindset, and you're not expecting like horror, you just want to laugh and have a good time and watch something fun, I think it's good. I'd definitely recommend it. But as we're talking about horror comedies, we gotta mention Fright Night. Fright Night is magnificent. It is one of the best vampire movies ever. It has a lot of comedy, it has a lot of action, and it actually has a lot of, you know, genuine scares and disturbing moments also. It does a great job respecting the old traditions. Like, you know, the main character, Charlie Brewster, he's always watching this guy, Peter Vincent, on TV, who's clearly supposed to be Peter Cushing, kind of named after Vincent Price also, but he's an aged horror star, like, you know, back in the 50s and 60s, he was, like, basically Van Helsing, but a character named Peter Vincent, who killed vampires in all these movies. Now he's, like, a horror host, and he's showing movies on TV, and he's always giving little tidbits about how to kill a vampire and everything. So it also kind of does that. It brings in that nostalgia of watching horror hosts on TV. And he ends up actually, you know, Charlie Brewster, a vampire moves next door. He has a hunch he's a vampire. Pretty quickly he learns he's a vampire. It's not really kept in the shadows that much. You know, he starts freaking out like, I gotta stop this vampire next to my house. And he only has a couple friends who are on his side. And it's just, you know, a few kids versus the vampire. So he goes to Peter Vincent to get him to fight the vampire, because Peter Vincent's show had just been canceled. You know, he's down and out, he needs some money, and Peter Vincent's weirded out because he's like, none of this stuff is real. I'm not really a vampire hunter. Vampires aren't real. But then after they get him to finally come over, and he's just supposed to, you know, lie to Charlie and be like, oh, I can tell that this guy is not a vampire, he's good. He does that, but then as he's leaving, he pulls out his cigarette case, and there's a mirror, and he sees that the vampire has no reflection. He must actually be a vampire. So then he reluctantly has to become the vampire hunter that he played all these years and team up with Charlie Brewster. And it's a really cool duo. I actually really like the dynamic between them. It's a lot of fun. Something I always found a little weird about the movie, though, there's a part where, you know, Chucky, he needs to find out how to kill a vampire. So he calls his friend. He has this weird friend. I think Ed is his name. The one who's like, you're so cool, Brewster. You know, that guy. And he calls him to ask him all the ways to kill a vampire. But it's like, Charlie is the one who's always watching Peter Vincent in horror movies and is obsessed with this crap. So, like, A, why would he not know about stakes through the heart and garlic and all that stuff and crosses? And B, why would he have to ask his friend who, yes, he's shown to be unpopular and bullied and stuff, but we don't really get that much information about him being like a horror nut the way Charlie is. We can assume he is, but Charlie seems like he's the guy. He knows everything about horror and vampires. So it's kind of weird that he has to go to him to find out what to do. It almost just seems like a plot convenience thing, but I don't know. It's not a big deal. There's a few things in this movie that are like just plot conveniences, but it doesn't matter. It's a great movie anyway. There was a Fright Night 2, and a lot of people don't like it. I actually don't think it's that bad. Is it as good as the first one? Not even close, but I think it's a worthy sequel. It actually is pretty fun to see Brewster and Peter Vincent teaming up again. Like, they're just a duo now, and they just always have to fight vampires, and they get themselves into these like crazy little adventures fighting off evil monsters. And it's a lot of fun. It actually showed me a lot of potential of where I think the series could have gone had it become a series. I have heard there was like behind the scenes legal issues going on with, you know, someone passing away, the creator passing away or whatever, and then like rights being thrown around, but it kind of got stopped from being a franchise. And I know that the second one was not very popular, so I don't know if it would have been a franchise anyway, but whether it be more movies or a TV show or even a cartoon series, I would have loved to see more Fright Night. I think this duo is just as good as Marty McFly and Doc Brown. It's like, you know, young high school kid and, you know, older man who's, you know, crazy about one thing. And they just end up on all these misadventures and having to take care of these situations that no one else knows about, clean them up without anyone noticing. And it's just kind of the same concept, but like the horror version. And I think they could have done that, not even just with vampires. They could have had, you know, the next one be like them fighting a werewolf epidemic that's going on in town, or say the Medusa monster is here, or the mummies have moved into town or something. Like, they could have done all kinds of different things. Gargoyles are coming to life on the buildings. Like, they could have had a million Fright Night movies of them just teaming up in this oddball duo, just fighting monsters, but unfortunately that never happened. I think this movie series has a lot of potential, and it kind of sucks it, you know, stopped prematurely. Later on in the 90s, there were still some pretty good vampire movies we gotta talk about From Dusk Till Dawn. From Dusk Till Dawn is insanity. If you watch it at first, it kind of feels almost like a Tarantino crime drama movie. It seems very grounded in reality, kind of disturbing, kind of slow-paced and realistic. And then all of a sudden they get to this bar called the Titty Twister, and it's just off the wall. It's just suddenly vampires everywhere, a vampire band playing instruments made out of dead bodies, Salma Hayek doing this sexy dance and then transforming into a snake vampire monster like she's coming out of Lair of the White Worm or something. This guy called Sex Machine who has a gun on his dick who gets turned into a giant rat. Played by horror special effects superstar Tom Savini, by the way. Like stabbing a heart with a pencil and just like all this crazy stuff. The movie goes off the walls, just gets violent as hell and just insane. And there's no sign of that coming earlier in the movie. This must have blown people's minds when they first saw the movie, and I guess it's part of the reason why it kind of bombed when it first came out and then gathered steam over time. It's become like an indie darling now, but I think in the past when it was, you know, in the 90s, it wasn't as big. Unfortunately, though, I went into it already knowing the twist was coming. I didn't know everything that was going to happen, but I knew about the twist. I had already seen the Salma Hayek dance and, like, you know, GIFs and stuff online, so I generally knew what was coming. But even when you know what's coming, it's still a ton of fun. I definitely recommend watching it. Unfortunately, though, it may not be your thing, because you may be enjoying the opening part and then disappointed when it goes off the rails, or you might be bored by the opening part and then just only love the crazy part at the end. So if you're like that, I would say just fast forward to the end and watch that. Get to the Titty Twister and then just watch the rest of the movie. Later on, I think vampires kind of went away from horror or even horror comedy, and they just started becoming stuff like comedy or romance. Like, you know, you have superhero stuff like Blade, you have romance stuff like Twilight. And, you know, even in the 80s, you had, like, Vampire's Kiss, which is hilarious, by the way. I mean, I know everyone's talked about it at this point, but Nicolas Cage and Vampire's Kiss He's such a terrible character, but he's funny as hell in that movie. It's definitely worth watching, though it's not really actually a vampire movie. But yeah, there's just so many vampire movies that have come out, whether they be comedies or romance or drama or horror or superhero action movies like Underworld. But I'm really just going to focus on what I think now is the best vampire movie, aside from Dracula, of all time. I think a lot of people would agree with me, but The Lost Boys. The Lost Boys is not only one of my favorite vampire movies, well, my favorite outside of Dracula, it is one of my favorite movies ever. It's possibly even in my top 10. It is not Halloween until I watched The Lost Boys. I first saw it when I was in 4th grade, I believe, or maybe 5th grade. And my father rented it, actually, and he said he had seen it before, and it was a great movie. And it was around Halloween time, and we watched it, and me and my entire family just absolutely loved this movie. And it immediately became a Halloween tradition. Like every year at Halloween in October, we would rent that movie and watch it. I know it's more of like a summery movie. It takes place at the end of summer going into the school year. It's not actually a Halloween movie. But for me, it's a Halloween movie because it's about vampires. I watched it then, so just hearing the music, hearing the songs, which are fantastic, by the way, we'll get into that in a bit, seeing the visuals and everything about that movie, it just feels like it is officially Halloween when that movie comes on. But The Lost Boys is such a perfect evolution of the vampire brand. While Fright Night was very good at paying respects to the old stuff and bringing it into the modern times, Lost Boys was really good at just reinventing it entirely for modern times. It's funny, it's insane, it's sexy, it's cool, it's just badass all around. It is probably one of the most 80s movies ever made. Honestly, just the fashion and the style, and Corey Haim's in it, Corey Feldman's in it. It's just great, but the comedy still stands. I think that the Frog Brothers are hilarious. Corey Haim is just like, oh my god, almost every line he has is hilarious. The grandfather is hilarious. It is a really, really funny movie, but it's also not just a funny movie. It's also a valid horror film, and it does have some genuinely creepy moments. And the ambiance is great. You know, you have like all the roaring carnival sounds on the boardwalk and everything mixed with like that howling wind, and everything about the movie just creates this really spooky, awesome atmosphere. And as I said before, the soundtrack is amazing, you know, I said it earlier, but the soundtrack, the songs in the movie are incredible. You have I Still Believe by Tim Capello. You know, he's that ultra buff, ripped, sweaty dude freaking making love to his saxophone as he's playing it. He's actually the sax player for Tina Turner, which is funny, actually. And all the Tina Turner songs from the 80s, when you hear that sax come on, it's that big buff dude playing it. But that song is so cool. Again, if I hear that song, it just sounds like Halloween. Cry Little Sister by Sisters of Mercy. That is amazing. That's like the intro theme as you're going over the water. The vampires are flying. And, you know, near the end, you hear that weird, like, bat kind of sonar-y noise that they make when they fly, which, again, is just synonymous with Halloween for me. Lost in the Shadows, you know, Say Hello to the Night. That's an awesome song. There's just so many good songs. Even the Echo and the Bunnyman cover of People Are Strange by the Doors is, like, pretty awesome. It's a pretty damn good cover. I think I might prefer it to the Doors one. I know that's kind of blasphemy, but it's really good and it fits the movie really well. It's got this really dry sense of humor. It's kind of satirical sense of humor of, like, you know, when you were on a boardwalk, a shady boardwalk in the 80s, it's like, any of these kids could be vampires for all we know. No one knows. So it was pretty clever. And like I said, the grandpa is hilarious. Nanook, the dog, is one of the greatest heroes of all time. You know, I salute him. He's a champion. And I love that nothing bad happens to him. He just kicks ass. He kills a vampire, knocks him into a bathtub full of garlic and everything. Like, the vampire death scenes near the end are just insane. Like, when this movie hits the ground running near the end, like, oh my god. Like, when this gets into motion, it's going. Like, when you get to the point where the montage happens and that crazy music starts picking up, dun 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 dun, and they're just riding their bikes around and getting holy water and everything, like, it just gets you so pumped. And from that point on, the movie is just going. It is going until the end, and it ends on a joke that is so perfectly hilarious. Like, there's basically a mic drop at the end of the movie because the joke is just so good, and everything can just end right there on that joke with everyone's dumbfounded look on their face. It is flawless. I love this movie. I could just gush about it for hours and hours and hours, go over every little scene. I quote this movie on like a weekly basis of my life, I think. Like, I just always quote this movie. Me and my brother, we quote this movie all the time. Kind of like how me and, you know, my best friend who I met in high school, we quote Home Alone on like a weekly basis. We quote Ren and Stimpy on like a weekly basis. I quote this movie, The Lost Boys, on like a weekly basis. Like multiple times a week I probably quote this movie. Random stuff too, not even like major lines. But everyone is fantastic in the movie. Everything about the movie is fantastic. I just think it's really like, it stands apart from other vampire movies. It doesn't need to have the legacy of Dracula and everything to be a fantastic movie. It 100% stands on its own, and it's just amazing. It's incredible. If you have never seen The Lost Boys, what the hell are you doing? Go watch it. It is the perfect representation of everything that was cool in the 1980s. So I hope you loved listening to this. I had a blast talking about all these vampire movies. You know, vampires is one of those categories where I could go on for 3 hours, so I'm kind of happy with how short this came out. But thanks for listening. I hope you had a great time, and stay tuned. There will be more. Happy Halloween. Do all the liking and subscribing and the sharing and the bell stuff.